Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice. Good morning to you, Dennis. How are you doing?
Morning, Eric.
As we discussed previously, our plan for today's episode is looking into Kamala Harris's criminal justice reform vision. She has published this document called Kamala's Plan to Transform the Criminal Justice System and Re-Envision Public Safety in America. And let's get to it. What have you read about this?
Well, so I've been looking forward to this because it's the first prosecutor and attorney general that we're examining here, and similar to Biden, she has to not only put forward a plan, but she also has to respond to her critics because she has quite a record on criminal justice, and a lot of it is good, much of it, perhaps even most of it, but some of it is not so good. And in the one of the earlier debates, she was called to task from another candidate.
I remember that, yeah.
And really just went back to the positive aspects of her record. I did not think she did a very good job of responding to the apt criticisms. And the one that I find, and there's many things in her record that I would find troubling, but the one to really spearhead today, because it's remarkable, is that when there was an effort afoot that the California prison system had agreed to attempt to reduce the number of prisoners and improve the prison system, and that, of course, the men and women, mostly men, who would have been released sooner than otherwise, similar to what we've seen in other states like Louisiana, the folks that were targeted were the lower risk and those that at the end of the sentence, and of course those are the ones that are trustees and responsible for prison operations.
Right.
Janitorial, laundry, etc.
Right.
Shining the boss's shoes, that type of thing. And so she objected on the grounds that the people be released were critical to operate the prisons. When the sheriff in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, was filmed responding to the Justice Reinvestment Initiative there, which we talked about in an episode you can link to.
Yeah, we've shared that clip.
It went viral.
Yep.
It went viral. And yet this is exactly what she did. So she's got a lot to overcome. Now, having said that, people can change their minds and people can improve their policies. The issue with Kamala Harris, though, is that to date, that as far as I'm aware, she's not said much about that. She's not said, well, that was then and this is now, this is what I've learned, etc. So it begins to feel a little bit like she's placating the left, which she has to placate in order to win the nomination.
Of course.
And unlike some of the other candidates, though, if she would win the nomination, which at this point is increasingly, evidently less likely, I mean, anything can happen.
Sure.
She would be in a position to be more centrist, even further right, which would help in the general election.
Right.
And as an African-American woman, she would have a great benefit from her ethnicity, et cetera. So I like Kamala Harris's candidacy, and I don't believe that she's really had much of an opportunity to catch fire yet, but obviously if she doesn't do it soon. Now, we have polls as recently as yesterday, the average polls of the polls kind of thing, that for the first time shows Elizabeth Warren ahead of Joe Biden by a slim 0.4 of a point or something. So things are changing, and Trump's attack on Joe Biden, I think, is having an impact. We'll see if he can bounce back from that or whether or not that's only going to get worse. But Bernie now, with his health issues and then recently the tragic death of his daughter-in-law.
Yes, I read about that.
You know, he's going to be hurting here, and he's slipping down into a strong third place. And I suspect that it's going to end up soon to be a Harris or Warren Biden fight. But the thing that I like about Kamala Harris is her potential to be
in the administration,
possibly as Attorney General. And when you consider her plan from that perspective, I like it a lot in some general aspects. Now, to begin with, as we jump in the plan, like the other candidates, she's got a good entree point, not a lot of research to it, not a lot of citations, not nearly as pedantic nor academic as Warren's, which means that it suffers a bit by comparison. But the entree point is pretty good. I like her language. She talks as similar as Warren does about fighting for justice, et cetera. So here's what I really like about Kamala Harris's plan is that she's got this heading, Here's how she'll do it. And she does something that I really like. She says, as president, there are 4 main levers that she can exercise to change criminal justice policy. And this is good stuff. She can, 1, work with Congress and use her executive authority to change law and policy at the federal level. Exceptionally clear, right off the bat. She's not in control. She doesn't make the mistake that Bernie makes in saying, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it.
Right.
She doesn't make, and Biden had a similar mistake, although I think his plan was, in general, relatively weak, without a whole lot of enthusiastic language in it. And similar to a point to Elizabeth Warren's, where she does, as you recall, talk about what she can do with the Congress, et cetera. But here she puts it right up front, and it gives the voter a context for a couple things. 1, a realistic appraisal of what she can do, beginning with this difficult task.
It sets expectations.
Right, and realistic. She doesn't say here, work with a bipartisan Congress or work with a Congress that's split, work with a Senate that's in the Republican control, but nonetheless, I like it. And that's only the first one of her 4 main levers. The second one is to investigate state and local actors through the Justice Department Civil Rights Division. Another clear point of a reference and attack, not dissimilar at all from the other plans in the fact that they all are doing some of this. But unlike the other plans, she puts this right up front, and it gives the reader, the voter, some context.
I don't recall a lot of other candidates talking about local actors. They went this far down as state, but not a lot of them acknowledged that there's municipality decision makers as well.
Elizabeth Warren's did.
Okay.
And referenced incentives,
right,
and things of that nature. And you can scroll through Warren's plan and see that, in fact, that she's doing this. But again, unlike Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren didn't say this right up front, which I think is really helpful and smart. And then the third one, empower, incentivize behavior on the state and local level through federal funding, which all the other candidates said. But again, redundantly, here it is up front. So you've got these contexts of these 4 levers, or the 4 cornerstones of her plan, et cetera, which I think is very smart. And then fourth, and this is critical too, use your voice as president to advocate for change. It's clear in the other plans that they plan on doing this, but you have to kind of discern it.
Right.
She's what I look for in a candidate at all levels is the degree of organization. And the assumption is, if you can't get your act together well enough to run clearly and be articulate about your plans, then how in heaven's name are you going to actually fill the role of whatever agency you want to head? And in this case, I like it. And and so it starts very positively, I think, and I like it. The next part of it, which I think is good, and I like the way that it reads, is she starts with 4 guiding principles. I believe that Elizabeth Warren started with similar kinds of principles, not quite clearly as articulated this, and all of them in their intros did talk about values and principles, so it's not like they're unclear. But this is what I like about what Harris is doing, and it shows, frankly, her legal training and her prosecutorial training to some degree, and her administrative capability, because as Attorney General, you're running a big agency in California. I mean, this is important. You've got to take a look at, I don't know all what Elizabeth Warren ever ran in terms of administrative capability, or Joe Biden, who's been a politician since he was the youngest senator in the nation, I believe, back some 60 years ago.
Wow.
Or not 60, 50 years ago, it's not that old. But here clearly stated, guiding principles: end mass incarceration, invest resources into evidence and community-based programs that reduce crime and help build safe and healthy communities.
Evidence and community-based. That's what we've been on about this whole time.
Very, very well stated. She did it in one sentence. She's got good staff support to be able to write something this clear, too. Law enforcement's primary mission is to serve and protect communities. It should instill trust to be accountable to the communities it serves. This is a very smart way to put this, because she leads with what they do. She doesn't lead with a criticism of them. She leads with what they're doing, and she wants to instill trust. This is a value-driven, principle-driven set of expectations here. Very smart. Number 3, the system must treat individuals equitably and humanely. And then 4, the system must protect vulnerable people. 3 and 4 could be combined, but nonetheless, I like the clarity here. And as an informed voter, and I think we've talked about, millennials require more research and more clarity on how things are done, and I think that helps you here. It hasn't formed itself in the polls to date because I don't think that she's caught fire or had enough going on. She's also fighting these huge crowds that Warren is getting, and Biden and Bernie are getting these huge crowds. She's up against it. But again, reading this as a potential attorney general of the United States, holy cow, right?
Yes.
So she goes into these four facets of her proposal. Number one, ending mass incarceration, evidence in community-based programs. And she's got a good, now she starts to provide some citations. She's got some really nice references to state and local legal restrictions as well as federal. And she's good with this research. She wants to make significant investments in policies that would end mass incarceration, investing in job training, housing, transportation. That's good. As a subpoint to that, ending the war on drugs, and then some good citations there. Legalizing marijuana. Here she says clearly supports states in legalizing marijuana. Legalize marijuana at the federal level, expunge convictions, and reinvest in the community. And then she has a reference to the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Act, which there's no link to it that I've seen so far. But so she's got some good clarity here, and she's got some good citations. She doesn't exactly say what makes her think that incentivizing local and state jurisdictions would create what's needed. And she doesn't say how much money she wants to put in it, which some of the other candidates did. But perhaps at this stage of the process, that may be smart.
Right.
And she goes into greater and greater detail. She wants to create grant programs by assessing a sales tax on marijuana and marijuana products. And she's got clear expectations about what that will do. And I love that she is citing our friend Mark Maurer at the Sentencing Project. I love that she's focusing on women convicted of offenses. I wish to God she wasn't talking about nonviolent offenses. This is prosecutorial bullshit. We've got to focus on people based on their risk and their need level, on and on, as we've talked before. This shows a little, or actually quite a bit of difficulty for me. It doesn't make sense just to focus on nonviolent people.
Right.
So I like that. She talks about sentencing reforms, ending mandatory minimums at the federal level, and incentivizing states to do the same. She references the Justice Safety Valve Act, which she does not link to, which is a little suspicious to me. And then she writes about clemency and things of that nature. And she's really quite clear about this stuff. And
For sure.
While I could be critical about a lack of detail, I'm not going to, at this point, really complain too much about that, because I'm enthused by the level of detail that she has, her organizational communication here, which gives me a feeling that, this is a woman, a candidate, who really could and would get into the detail, do a plan of action, delegate it appropriately, and get the job done. More realistic in some sense than what we've seen from some of the other candidates.
Yeah, some of these bullet lists go like 5 or 6 deep.
And there's bullets beyond the bullets.
Right.
And see, this is what I mean by the level of detail. This is good staff work. There's one of the things that she puts in here about the National Criminal Justice Commission and reflecting back to the last time it was seriously examined, which put a quote in that was in 1967 under the Johnson-Katzenbach Commission. And you're doing a 360-degree assessment, and then she goes into bullet after bullet about looking at people, studying individuals incarcerated for violent offenses to provide recommendations via evidence-based findings. So while she talked earlier about focusing on women and nonviolent offenses, which I would be critical of, here she gets right at it. And I think it's really good. And she talks about these offenses being at the state level and talks about studies that talk about long sentences but doesn't cite those studies, which I think she could do and continue on the research approach here. It's for a candidate to talk about evidence-based practices, this is the first place that you can show that you really mean it, you're doing it, and you know what the evidence shows. She's got a nice bullet here about redefining the metrics and the data we use to measure success in the system. People in the system use terminology such as recidivism, even though there is no good definition of what that means. That's not exactly true. There's 4 definitions, which is confusing, but nonetheless.
I think we might have actually touched on that in like episode 1.
Yeah, way back when.
Yep.
And so it shows that she can touch on this stuff with some sense. She wants to reform community supervision. I don't remember or recall, and we could check this, that any of the other candidates were clear about this part of it. They focused on the prisons and the penal institutions and the large issues, but here she's talking about things that shows that she has got staff on board like her, come from the criminal justice system. She knows more about the system than any other candidate because she's running. Invest money in states to shorten the length of probation and other forms of community supervision where appropriate and where it serves the interests of justice. This is very, very insightful. The impact that people have is not just because they go to prison. Probation is that term of supervision prior to incarceration in most cases.
Right.
So she touches on that.
Yes.
Investing money in states for jail time, technical violations, reforming parole. It's good that she gets into it. She's got bullets here about ending private prisons. She's very clear about this. She believes we must end private detention centers for undocumented immigrants. Good, she says it. It's kind of left there. But then in the next set of bullets, she talks about helping children thrive. And then she links to several studies. She links to studies about brain maturity. She creates a Bureau of Children and Family Justice and reflects on the fact that she did that in California. And she really goes into a lot of detail about the broken foster care system, the pipeline of children from child welfare, the justice system.
Wow.
The other candidates didn't do this. They might have touched on the school to prison pipeline. When you fail from school, you end up with a higher rate of involvement in the juvenile system.
Right.
Here she does something that those of us enmeshed in the system understand. It's not just about that. It's also about the child care system, because when kids age out of foster care is when they really get into a lot of difficulty.
Yeah, you can tell that she's gone deep in this area before. Her fidelity is a lot higher here.
Yes. And again, it talks about research, but doesn't link to it, referencing school-based health services, a positive impact on absences, et cetera. Well, so link to it. I mean, she obviously has the research. I'm not sure why the links are as weak as they are. They're not. I mean, there's some of them.
Yeah, I wonder what there must be, as someone that makes web pages for a living, I wonder if there's any good research on if it's possible to have too many links such that it's hard for people to actually make it all the way down to the bottom of your document because they get distracted.
I don't think so. The link doesn't. You have the option, obviously, you know this,
right.
to click or not click. It doesn't make it any longer.
True.
Because where it says research, that's what you click on.
Right, which is, yeah, that's the nice thing about this hypertext that we have on the internet built out of, is that you can do that. Yeah, so she should put more links.
I mean, there's a dozen bullets here about juveniles and whatnot. It's really good. Our next major bullet heading is promoting rehabilitation and reintegration. She does link back on track programs, which I did not go to, not having time yet, focusing on education, job training, and treatment, and gets into a lot of specific. She does something here. She talks about a reentry educational course to mandate federal prisons to provide a reentry educational course that provides, among other things, information on acquiring ID and their options with respect to housing, education, treatment. This is very smart. And one of the things that, just from a personal reference, I've been promoting this for a decade, and nobody's jumped on it. I've said it again and again. I've written a course for reentry, and to see it here is I would embrace it enthusiastically. Nice. She wants to create an advisory board of directly impacted individuals to make recommendations for successful reentry. Nobody does this. Everybody has said to one point or another that, almost like a mentioning, the people that are most involved need to be part of the commission, et cetera. She's the only candidate that says, I'm going to have a board of just formerly incarcerated persons. This is good stuff.
Right.
This is good stuff. Talks about banning the box, restoring voting rights, ending federal bans on formerly incarcerated individuals for certain licensing, a lot of detail. And remember, we're all under the first bullet here of reducing mass incarceration. So this is quite good. Next whole section, law enforcement's primary mission is to serve and protect, to instill trust and accountability. And she opens up, and you'll know how much I like this. Law enforcement is a critical part of our communities, and we should appreciate the sacrifices of those who serve on our behalf. And we should also recognize that the majority are dedicated public servants who serve honorably. That is the way to open up this section.
Right.
And then to say, but at the same time, there's communities, especially communities of colors, that don't have the higher level of trust. And she goes into a lot of detail, clearly understanding the huge issue of working with local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies. I haven't seen the reference to tribal in any of the other plans. and we need to understand that too, there is pandemic problems in tribal entities, and she touches on that here. And again, not to minimize these things, but goes into an awful lot of detail with references and experiences, some of them cited, some of them not. Creates a National Police Systems Review Board, which would require an act of Congress, which she says she would fight for, and then goes into incentives and additional funding and whatnot. And then increasing resources for the U.S. Department of Justice, restoring the community-oriented policing services, the COPS office, which I thought did a decent job, and gets very clear. She wants to invest federal money and create accountability mechanisms to incentivize state and local governments to provide police use of force training that includes, bullet, de-escalation, crisis intervention, mental health, proportionality, deadly force investigations, medical treatment, oral warnings when feasible, psychological roots of bias, procedural justice. These are just bullet points, and yet you get the idea, holy cow, she really knows what she's talking about here. Good staff support, good research. And in fact, it goes into so many details. We don't have time to cover them all. And this whole section, I think, is very, very strong, much stronger, much clearer than what we've seen. She does then go into a whole range of citations now when she's talking about expanding access to mental health services and trauma-informed care, prioritizing mental health informed responses in law enforcement. Very good stuff.
So there's still a lot of spending going on here, but it doesn't. It feels like spending with a reason behind it more than, I don't know, some of the other candidates.
And also taking advantage of what funding is already there, not providing specifics about how much more funding she'll provide. I'm not exactly sure why the candidates do that. On the one hand, we might criticize them for not being specific, but on the other hand, I'm not sure how much good it does for a candidate to end up here with another $1 trillion price tag.
Right.
And when you've got candidates like Bernie and Warren that are also providing free education and free health care for everyone, which they referred to, which so far in her, she doesn't do that. This is purely around justice reform. But, it's good. And then she goes into prosecutorial accountability. She doesn't have a lead-in for this, which I'm a little surprised about. But she goes into a lot of detail, and then a similar set of detail on support for public defenders. So this section is very strong. A good number of citations, not as many, but referencing her record, referencing examples. So I think it's a pretty strong section.
Yep.
Next section on treating individuals equitably and humanely, stop criminalizing poverty, ending the bail system. She's got some good data, some good research there. She has a pretrial integrity and safety act with Senator Rand Paul. She doesn't reference it. She doesn't cite it. I don't know why she wouldn't do that. It just would be so simple, so that we know exactly what she would otherwise be talking about. Wants to end the use of fines that criminalize the poor. She wants to invest money in states. I'm not exactly sure why she thinks that would work. There'd have to be some pretty steep incentives. And, some detail there. She does have a section on humane treatment of prisoners. She wants to end the death penalty. And she's got some record there that might come back to haunt her. She did not seek the death penalty for an individual that was accused of killing a police officer, despite facing relentless political pressure to do so. I'm not sure if she has a sublime record of not supporting the death penalty, citing one case rather than a record, a fuller record, would require some digging. I suspect that she supported the death penalty plenty, but I don't know that for sure. Wants to end solitary confinement. I don't know how. I don't know nothing about states' incentives here. We know 85% of all prisoners in the country are locked up at the state level and the local level. And then prohibit prisons from making a profit, private prisons and private prisons and telecommunications. It's just good detail. Doesn't say how she'll do it. Keeping families intact. And this is strong language, ripping families apart creates lasting harm and undermines the goal of building safer and healthier communities. We should strive to maintain family connections. She says more in those two sentences than some of these other candidates did in a page. She just has a good knack for getting this stuff done. Talks about supporting the First Step Act, doesn't link to it. Has co-sponsored an act called Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, and it goes into 3 bullets about what it does, good stuff, but doesn't link to it. I don't know why. And it's just kind of inconsistent here. It's almost like, hey, we got to get this thing out.
Right.
So, we'll use the citations we have, but she probably ought to go back and give it another shot. And then finally, to protect vulnerable people, clearing the nationwide rape kit backlog in the first term. Here she's specific where she should be. Very good stuff. Invest $1 billion to allow states to fully implement. I suspect that is a research number, and points to her record as Attorney General that she eliminated the backlog.
Did she?
So good stuff here, and examples of her actual activity that would show, obviously, the support that she knows what she's doing.
Right.
Has a big section here on protecting consumers against fraud and fighting for victims' rights. And, and that's it. I like this plan a lot. Some might say that it suffers alongside Warren's and perhaps Bernie's, but Bernie's is way too over promising. Warren's does less over promising, but does link it to some of the other things that I think are pretty perhaps over promising on healthcare for all and education for all, which means that if those things don't happen, then these things can't happen. And Harris doesn't do that. So this fulfills my hope that somebody with this type of history and experience in the justice system has done a good job. I would say, all things considered, this is the best plan of the ones that we've reviewed from the standpoint of the language, the realistic appraisal, and mostly the organization. And the feeling you get from reading it is, one, she knows what she's talking about. This is a person who knows enough to knows how to get it done. And this is an application to be the Attorney General of the United States. I like it.
Yeah,
I like it a lot.
Well, and she's worked in the criminal justice system as a prosecutor in a way that none of the other candidates really have. So it makes sense that she would, have been able to peer inside the machine a little bit and have these insights.
I'm surprised that you can Google and then add to the notes some of the press on this. Vox did a good review of explaining it, and much of what I've talked about today certainly reflects that similar thinking. But I wonder what she's done by way of express details of this, town hall meetings. She should be running more on this than perhaps some of the other stuff, because this obviously is her long suit. And I think she could get a lot of mileage out of this looking at the various candidates. Yes.
There was an episode of another podcast that I listened to that talked about how the Kamala Harris candidate differs from as she was as a prosecutor, and I found that very interesting. I will look that up and include it in the show notes too. And these show notes will be at seekjustice.fm/023.
Well, good. I think I don't know if you want to do another candidate. I think we've hit the top four, although it might be interesting to take a look at Cory Booker's from the standpoint. He's another guy that's got a lot of experience in New Jersey as the mayor and as a state legislator. We could look at his. We could look at
and he also seems
others.
like a likely cabinet pick for for President Warren. Or
maybe. Well, we'll leave that up to you. See where we want to go. And it's been a pleasure. And we'll talk soon.
Okay. Bye, Dennis.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you've just heard, you can support us by telling a friend or sharing us on social media. All of our episodes can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be reached at seekjusticefm@gmail.com or via our Twitter account @seekjusticefm. See you next week.